Well, good morning, good afternoon to you all. Pardon me, and thank you for joining us for Pathways to Low Carbon Space Heating in Edmonton, Alberta, Electrification versus Hydrogen, presented today by the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub. My name is Barbara Coral. I'm an executive director here at Alberta Energy and Minerals, and I'm very pleased to be your moderator for today's session. I will apologize for a very scratchy voice and a bit of a cough, so I apologize for assaulting your ears. I'll do my best to mute when I have to cough. Now, before we get things started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Hydrogen Hub is located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We encourage everyone watching to reflect on the territory, treaties, and people where you live and work. I also want to give a shout out to the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub, an alliance of organizations from the region, including the municipalities, economic development organizations, academics, Indigenous neighbors, of course, as well as the provincial and federal governments. The hub works together with industry partners and associations to accelerate the development of a hydrogen economy in the region. And I would say, as one who's been involved with this work now for several years, really appreciate the bias for action that this organization has shown. Now, this webinar is part of the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub's ongoing webinar series. I'm sure many of you have already taken some of them. They're meant to provide industry, government, and investors with knowledge and tools to help you act on the unique competitive advantage in the Edmonton region for low cost, low carbon hydrogen production and adoption. You can see on past webinars, for instance, on the website erh2.ca, and this presentation will be available there tomorrow. So assuming you find it interesting, and I'm sure you will, be sure to share with your colleagues. For information and updates about future webinars, be sure to join the mailing list and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Now, today's topic is pathways to low carbon space heating. And like all other sectors of the economy, we know we need to decarbonize space heating in Canada. Electrification is often brought up as the primary solution, but the question remains, is this the optimal pathway across the country for Canada, for Alberta specifically? Today's presentation from Brodie Chalmers will explore the cost of low carbon space heating pathways in Edmonton to advance this important conversation. I'm pleased to introduce Brodie to you today. Brodie is a mechanical engineer with more than 20 years of experience in distribution design, transmission planning, and midstream project development. More recently, he's dedicated his time to natural gas system decarbonization with a focus on hydrogen infrastructure design and project economics. His significant knowledge of energy systems enables pursuit of optimal and least cost pathways to decarbonization at scale. And I will say, over the years, I have worked with Brodie and found him to be an incredibly knowledgeable individual. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy what he has to say today. Before I turn things over to Brodie, a few housekeeping matters. Throughout the presentation, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to them later on in the webinar. We ask that you use the Q&A function for questions only rather than the chat box, as this helps keeps everything in one place for record-keeping purposes. If you like someone's questions, feel free to upvote it, and this will help us determine the order that questions will be addressed. So now, Brodie, it is over to you.
Okay, thank you, Barb, for your kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today to learn about this important topic for the Edmonton region and the province. You'll notice in the bottom left corner, I have on all of these slides this one ATCO conference logo. This presentation is actually adapted from presentation I did for an internal audience in early November, and then that presentation was actually adapted from a smaller, shorter presentation I did at the World Petroleum Congress um, earlier this fall in Calgary. Um, so I think, I would be remiss if I didn't discuss hydrogen properties and safety just a little bit before I get going, because hydrogen is new, and you hear a lot of things, certainly in social media and even in some publications around hydrogen properties and safety. Um, and so I'll just go through a few points that I think are important for everyone to understand. Number one is that NOx, well, combustion of hydrogen does produce NOx. Our testing, as well as the testing of several other organizations, has shown that NOx can be maintained at similar levels to natural gas combustion, or even reduced. And in fact, we've developed a prototype hydrogen combi furnace with a company in Calgary called Gradient Thermal, and that particular appliance would qualify as ultra low NOx. Um, we often hear that hydrogen, because of its low volumetric energy density, you need to substantially increase the size of pipelines to move adequate amounts of hydrogen energy. This is also not true. Hydrogen is very slippery, very low viscosity and very low density, and it can travel nearly 3 times as fast in a pipeline for an equivalent pressure drop per unit length. So for instance, we've modeled the entire Edmonton gas distribution system at 20% hydrogen, and there's about roughly 12 to 15,000 kilometers of pipe in Edmonton, and we would need capacity reinforcement on just 2 kilometers of pipe to support that 20%. Now we would need some more for 100%, and we are in the process of that modeling exercise. And I have considered those costs in this study, which you'll see later on. Odorant remains effective in hydrogen, natural gas blends, as well as pure hydrogen, and this has been demonstrated both theoretically and empirically in studies in the UK. Hydrogen can be accurately measured at the point of delivery, and hydrogen systems can be designed with less overall risk than natural gas. Now, I'll get into that a little bit in the next slide, so I won't elaborate on it here. If an existing distribution system is natural gas tight, it will also be hydrogen tight. There's some interesting findings around leaks in hydrogen. So at higher pressures, at sort of distribution pressure and above, hydrogen leaks at roughly a ratio of 1 over the inverse of the square root of the density. So, roughly 3 times as quickly on a volumetric basis as does natural gas, but roughly equivalent on an energy basis, given its lower volumetric energy density. However, inside a customer premises where we operate at 1/4 psi, hydrogen has been found to leak at the same volumetric rate, and therefore approximately 1/3 of the energy rate of natural gas in empirical studies. And this is somewhat of a surprising finding. It's been attributed to what they call a tortuous leak path. But in fact, we do have less leakage inside properties on an energy basis in hydrogen service. Distribution pipeline system materials are compatible with hydrogen. We actually have tested all ANSI B149 materials and have found that there are no issues with hydrogen compatibility. Of course, this does not obviate the need for an engineering assessment to ensure compatibility with the introduction of hydrogen, but there's no showstoppers or large-scale replacements that we anticipate would be necessary to facilitate hydrogen distribution. Now, this is the risk slide. It's important to note that 95% of the risk associated with using natural gas for space heating today is associated with carbon monoxide. This is particularly true here in North America and Alberta, where we use forced air heating and where carbon monoxide can potentially be pushed through a premises due to ducted forced air heating. With hydrogen, we eliminate carbon monoxide entirely as we move to 100% hydrogen. And while hydrogen does have a wider explosive limit and lower ignition energy, this can be mitigated with appropriate engineering controls such that the overall risk is reduced in hydrogen service. So I think just a little bit of an overview of energy basics here. Probably you didn't think you were attending this for a high school physics review, but I'll try to be brief. I think it's important to understand the difference between energy and power. And in the gas system and the electricity system, we do use two different sets of units, GJs in natural gas and kilowatt hours in electricity. Both of those are energy units, but I do think we have some confusion around, for instance, megawatts versus megawatt hours in the electricity system. So just a quick refresher on some of the sort of the basics. So velocity is distance over time. So, kilometers per hour, meters per second. Acceleration is velocity over time, or meters per second squared. Force is mass times acceleration, or kilograms times meters per second squared. This is also known as a Newton. Work, which is also energy, is force times distance, or Newton meters, also known as a joule. So a GJ is a billion joules. And then power is energy divided by time. So Newton meters per second, or watts. And this is why we need to take kilowatts and multiply it by hours to get to kilowatt hours to get back into an energy term, which is time independent. So, going through these calculations, we find that 1 gigajoule, or a billion joules, is equal to 277.8 kilowatt hours. Next slide, I'll just give you some examples to understand scale a little bit. So if we look at a Tour de France champion climbing the Alpe d'Huez to a summit finish, they'll be putting out roughly 400 watts, or 0.4 kilowatts, or 0.4 kilowatt hours in 1 hour. A Tesla Model S Plaid accelerating to 100 kilometers an hour in 2 seconds would use approximately the same amount of energy, 0.4 kilowatt hours. One solar panel, each panel these days is around 400 watts. At peak capacity, so noon sun, would make about 0.4 kilowatt hours in an hour. And then if we were to look at something like the Shepherd Power Plant east of Calgary, it's an 800 megawatt plant, it would make that 0.4 kilowatt hours in about 0.0018 seconds. So just some idea around energy and how quickly it can either be produced or consumed by different systems. So some context on emissions in the province. Now I do have a photo here of an oil sands operation, just because by far oil and gas emissions are the largest contribution to GHG emissions in Alberta. Oil and gas emissions, including fugitive emissions, are about 51%. Whereas space heating in Alberta is only about 6%. It's slightly more than 3% for residential and slightly less than 3% for commercial and institutional. What I'll be talking about today is exclusively building heat and hot water, so no industrial customers considered in this evaluation at all. I think one of the the important points to note is Canada is committed to economy-wide zero emissions, or economy-wide emissions reduction of 40 to 45% by 2030. And hydrogen, one of the great advantages of hydrogen is that we can repurpose existing natural gas infrastructure for hydrogen delivery. And this is, it just represents huge potential for decarbonization of space heating in the province. All right, so some assumptions that went into this study. I think there's a lot of organizations that have looked at space heating and suggested that electrification is the optimal pathway. But what we found is a lot of these studies stop after electric transmission. And they don't look at electric distribution at all. And unfortunately, that is where the vast majority of the costs enter into the equation in Alberta. Now, we know that Alberta's electric transmission system is really quite strong and there is some excess capacity. While we would have to build incremental transmission to support space heating, it's not nearly to the same degree as the distribution assets that require reinforcement. For this reason, I've held transmission costs roughly where they are today at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. We've used an assumption of 2.2 for annual heat pump coefficient of performance, and heat pump coefficient of performance under peak demand of 1. Now, there are heat pumps today that can do a little bit better than this. It's not really a matter of whether they work or not. It's more a matter of whether they can deliver adequate energy on the coldest days and what the consequences are for the electric grid. We've assumed an average furnace fleet efficiency of 85%, and I've assumed that hydrogen space heating would occur at that same 85%. In reality, this would probably be pushed closer to 95%, given that it would be newer appliances that would be deployed in hydrogen service. I've assumed $250 a kilogram for low carbon hydrogen produced through ATR with CCS. That's equivalent to about 1761 a GJ. And for the electricity commodity, I've assumed 12.5 cents. That is the mid-range of the Pembina Institute's net zero electricity report that was published just a couple of months ago. I've assumed here that hydrogen transmission pipeline is new, not repurposed, and is owned and operated by the gas distributor, and that the costs are allocated exclusively to the distribution rate base. Electricity supply. So this is really important. This has become a bit of a hot button political issue recently. I'm not going to opine on the politics of all of this. I will just simply present data. It's important to know that wind and solar, more than they are intermittent, they're actually reliably absent when they are most needed. So I've said before that wind and solar are a bit like the Toronto Maple Leafs of the energy system, solid regular season, but typically out early in the playoffs. And so what you see here is that when it's between -30 and -35, the highest ever measured wind capacity factor is about 7%, typically about 5% of installed capacity. Solar, even worse than that. And this is partly due to the short sunlight hours and the angle of the sun at that time of year. But also, evidently, there are other issues that seem to be preventing the sun from reaching solar panels during these periods of time. Now, we might say that, well, we can install batteries to deal with this, and I would say that that's highly unlikely, given that 1 day of space heating in Edmonton would require about 220 gigawatt hours of electricity. For the whole province, space heating would be close to 700 gigawatt hours of electricity. And in 2022, global EV battery production was about 550 gigawatt hours of batteries to support EVs. So, to support the province for a day, we need more than 100% of global EV battery production. And these periods of poor renewables performance can last for weeks at a time. And if you don't believe that, I'd encourage you to go have a look at February of 2019, where we had nearly 3 weeks of very cold weather and almost no renewable production. On the hydrogen supply, we would require about 920,000 GJs a day of hydrogen at minus 36C, which is our design temperature for Edmonton. That's a minus 36C average temperature over the 24-hour period. That equates to about 91 million GJs or 642,000 tons of hydrogen annually. This is just 27% of Alberta's existing hydrogen production of about 2.4 million tons, as was identified in Alberta's hydrogen roadmap. We also know that low-cost hydrogen storage is feasible in the Lotsburg Salt Formation, northeast of Edmonton. ATCO already owns 10 salt caverns in the region, 6 for natural gas, 4 for other liquid hydrocarbons. We're actually in a feasibility study right now, testing to confirm that hydrogen storage is achievable. But the capital cost of this storage would be roughly $2 per kilowatt hour. And that compares to battery storage of, roughly $100 to $150 a kilowatt hour. One of the arguments you hear is that, well, when our renewables aren't producing, what we really need is more interconnections to other jurisdictions with strong renewables or hydro resources. BC being, a strong focus of that argument. We know that BC is making significant strides towards electrification of space heating. And given the warmer climate in the Lower Mainland, you get higher COPs and better heat pump performance. But what we see here on the right is that a cold day in Vancouver is almost without fail a cold day in Edmonton. Electric peaks also occur almost identically on the same hour in the two jurisdictions. So if you were to plot BC electricity consumption in February 19 over top of Alberta electricity consumption in February 2019, both jurisdictions hit a new peak consumption in the exact same hour, even taking the 1 hour time difference into account. So what this means is that to the extent we see electrification of space heating BC, there's just simply not going to be any electricity from BC to import into Alberta when we need it most to facilitate our existing electricity peak and or a space heating peak. And so while the tie line would be very, very useful, I'm not saying we shouldn't build something like that, its value may come to a large degree for the export of excess wind and solar produced in Alberta, particularly in some of the warm summer months. So still have value, and in certain periods of the time, even during Chinooks in the winter when wind is very, very strong in Alberta, there may be exports available. And certainly during more mild temperatures, imports could be facilitated. So on the demand side, Edmonton distribution heating peak is about 920,000 GJs a day, which is equivalent to about 256,000 megawatt hours a day. The peak electric heating requirement for Edmonton would be about 9,100 megawatts after accounting for the improved efficiency of electric space heating. That's about 93% of existing average day electricity demand, or 75% of existing peak day electricity demand in all of Alberta, including grid connected industry. That's not just residential electricity consumption. The annual electricity heating requirement for Edmonton, however, is just about 9,800 gigawatt hours, or only approximately 11% of total existing annual generation. So you're starting to see the problem here. what you end up doing is designing an electric system to accommodate a peak day with very poor utilization. What that does is it drives up rates. It drives up the cost of delivery because utilities have a revenue requirement that needs to be paid. Um, so on a cold day, residential space heating demand is about 66%, and commercial space heating demand is about 34% on our gas distribution system, which is true for Edmonton as well. And this is how our distribution revenue requirement is divided. It is about 60, it's about 70% residential, 30% commercial. And that's because peak day drives facilities, and facilities are what are paid for in delivery charges. Continuous electric heating demand at minus 36 C per customer is going to be about 15 kilowatts for a typical residential customer in the province, and about 80 kilowatts for a typical commercial customer in the province. Typical commercial customer is a little harder to define, but if you're looking at it in gas terms, this would be a customer that's right on the very bottom end of our low use, or sorry, on the very bottom of our mid-use rate class. So that just kind of gives you a sense of what those customers look like. Now, understand that electric distribution systems are designed today in Alberta for roughly 3 to 5 kilowatts of coincident space heating demand, or of coincident demand. So if we add space heating to that, we're moving to about 18 to 20 kilowatts of coincident electricity demand. And so what that means is there's actually not really a single wire, there's not a single transformer, there's not a single substation, service line, anything like that that can accommodate the demands associated with space heating at scale. Everything needs to be reinforced or replaced. The next few slides, I will go through some of the costs of that infrastructure. And I guess the other thing I should mention here too is this isn't like EV charging, right? I mean, I actually have an EV. I charge in a 30 amp circuit at about just under 6 kilowatts. That covers a commute in sort of an hour and a half, 2 hours. It's easy to stage charging through the evening and night so that your electricity demand doesn't necessarily spike when everyone gets home from work. This isn't something you can do with space heating. Space heating is all on, all at the same time. And when it's 35 below, there's just no staging that can be done to deal with this. So just a quick aside, total ATCO gas demand. I've got the COP curve here for the best in market heat pump that we've been able to identify thus far. There are a lot of these. It's a Tosot Apex unit. A lot of these are being installed in Edmonton today, most in conjunction with a gas furnace for the colder days, but there are some off-gas installations as well. What you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but this is actual gas consumption data converted into electricity. So basically what we've done here is taken the gas consumption and multiplied by 0.85 to show you what electric demand would look like if all space and water heating demand in the province were electrified. And as you can see here, we're looking at, roughly 27 gigawatts in December of 2021 would have been needed to supply space heating. And all these white areas here, this all represents unutilized or underutilized capital. And what that turns into is delivery charges. So the existing peak is about 12.1 gigawatts. These are actually averages, but what you can see here is that electric peaks, like existing electricity demand peaks, coincide with space heating demand peaks already, and then this will just be further magnified by electric space heating at scale. So although heat pumps are very efficient, and I'm not arguing whether they work or not, they do work. Although I will say that the largest Toso Apex that we have been able to find for residential purposes starts to not necessarily produce enough heat for a typical Alberta home at roughly minus 25 C. It would still provide heat, but it would need supplementation through electric resistance or a natural gas furnace as of that roughly minus 25 C temperature. And of course, with the demands on the system, you're really taxing the electric system. Given the performance of renewables during cold weather, 100% of the power would have to be dispatchable. So whoever's doing grid planning, they need to ensure that whatever power is required for these space heating peaks, it's got to be dispatchable one way or another, and it's got to be able to last days and weeks. That likely leads to natural gas peaking facilities, but in a scenario where they don't run very often, it's hard to imagine who would invest in such facilities without either very, very, very high marginal cost of electricity or some sort of capacity payments. So on the residential side, I think it's been widely acknowledged that space heating costs at the customer level will be higher in an electricity system than in a hydrogen system. It was confirmed in a recent UK report from the National Infrastructure Commission as well. These costs are probably low. I mean, I think Enercan says the cost of a heat pump installation in Canada today is about 18,400. The recent increase in the heat pump rebate for those converting from oil heating has shown that $10,000 is probably low. It's likely closer to the $20,000 mark. An earth source heat pump hot water heater would be necessary, and then a panel at about 2,500. In contrast, at the customer level, a new furnace installation is really all that's necessary. And we anticipate that the hydrogen combi furnace we've developed in partnership with Gradient could be installed in this $9,000 range. I actually have a natural gas version of this furnace in my house, and I can say I didn't pay $9,000 to have it installed. The other thing I'll say at the customer level is disruption from converting to hydrogen is likely quite a bit less, given that there will be, especially in developed basements, a lot of wire pulling. I mean, I can tell you when I put my EV charger in, I had to have electricians fish wires through a full developed basement because my electric panel is actually on the opposite side of the house from both the mechanical room and where the charging occurs. So there's just a lot more interference in people's homes in this electric scenario. On the commercial side, again, panels will be necessary, and air source heat pumps that would do space and water heating is what we've assumed here. These costs are a little looser. We've just basically 10x the costs from the residential side, where we're a little more confident on what the costs would be. But again, you can see the electricity costs are estimated to be higher here. How these conversions would be funded isn't clear, but I will say that by 2030, with $170 carbon tax, ATCO Gas will be collecting roughly $2.4 billion a year from gas distribution customers in the province, which is more than adequate to start paying for some of these costs. So the big cost, this is where the big costs come in. This is electric distribution infrastructure. So we've assumed that 75% of service lines would have to be upgraded to accommodate electric space heating. In Edmonton, EPCOR's practice has typically been to install 100 amp services. There are some 200s, but the vast majority are 100. distribution circuits to deal with the voltage drop associated with, a sort of 5x increase in coincident demand. You're going to need to loop or replace existing circuits. So I'm not suggesting you put in 5 of them. I'm saying you'd put in one, and it would be a larger diameter and would be able to carry more electricity. Now, these costs could be mitigated to some degree to the extent that circuits in the region are in conduit. And certainly overhead lines would be less expensive to replace. I've assumed this is all undergrounded, direct buried. But I would argue that if you're relying on electricity for space heating, you'd likely want these circuits underground for reliability and resiliency reasons. Transmission, just 400 million, given that, transmission is strong in the province. This is not a hard number. This number could very easily be quite a bit more, but we've assumed that it's modest at this point. Transformers, about 3.5 billion. There's one of these for every sort of 5 to 10 customers, and they would all need to be replaced. In fact, we're already seeing transformers pop from time to time as more and more customers adopt electric vehicles and charge them at home. Substations, really all existing substations would require upgrades, but we would also have to build a number of new substations in the region. And these numbers here, 1.5 billion, I've assumed that we would be able to acquire land relatively easily. In reality, I'm not sure how easy that would be, nor are we sure where these substations could be feasibly located, particularly in built-up parts of the city. On the hydrogen side of the equation, we've proposed a hydrogen transmission network in the transportation and utility corridor connected to a number of large pressure letdown stations. These pressure letdown stations are actually easier for hydrogen because of the negative Joule-Thomson coefficient for hydrogen. It actually warms up a little bit when the pressure is cut rather than cooling down like natural gas. So we don't need line heaters anymore. That makes these stations quite a bit less complex than what we see in natural gas service. So we assume just $100 million here for stations. There's 11 of them in total in this plan. We do believe we will need to reinforce gas distribution system capacity, and we've put $500 million at this today, but further modeling will confirm the number. I actually expect it will come in at less than $500 million. We would need to replace meters at individual properties, and this number comes out to about $500 million for the residential and commercial customers combined. So, you hear a lot about, well, how would you go about converting all these customers to hydrogen? And, I think it is achievable. I mean, it's very similar to what ATCO has been involved with in the past with a meter move program, where we went in and moved meters from the inside of people's basements to the outside and above ground. We went in and did this sort of street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood for a period of time about 20 years ago. On the other hand, a lot of these electric circuits that need to be reinforced are just simply going to require digging, road closures. Now, granted, some of these wires may be in boulevards and not be quite as intrusive as this. Nevertheless, these disruptions to the public will inevitably be significant. So capital costs and rate implications overall, that's what comes next. So overall, electric system upgrades, including appliances to facilitate electric space heating in the region, just about $30 billion. Whereas for hydrogen, it's roughly 10. Note, however, that the utility costs, so utility rate base additions for the electric side are about 20.4 billion, whereas the utility rate base additions are about 2.7 billion in the hydrogen case. Now, keep in mind that EPCOR's rate base today is roughly $2 billion. So this is about a 10x increase in EPCOR's installed rate base. Some of the economic assumptions that went into this study. So I've used Alberta Utilities allowed equity thickness of 37%, 8.5% return on equity, and 5% return on debt, straight line depreciation over 50 years. I've assumed that EPCOR's O&M doubled despite a roughly 10x increase in rate base. In hydrogen, I assumed about a 10% increase in O&M. It's about $50 million, given the limited incremental infrastructure. You got to remember too that ATCO's rate base is for the whole province, and this is infrastructure installed just in Edmonton. Existing electricity revenue requirement was maintained at 50-50 residential commercial. However, the space heating additions to the rate base are split at 70-30, just like we have in the gas distribution system today. Hydrogen infrastructure is split 70-30 residential commercial, just like the gas system. And this is defined by peak day, as I mentioned earlier. Revenue requirement is assigned to customer groups and on a dollars per customer per year revenue requirement. So, what you end up with here is because your electric distribution costs become so high, and they are the utility has to collect that revenue. These costs are far less influenced by home efficiency improvements than are the hydrogen costs. So in the hydrogen cost, the vast majority of the costs are fuel. It's hydrogen fuel. And by improving efficiency within the home, whether that's envelope or appliance performance, you can significantly reduce your space heating bill. On the electricity side, these building efficiency improvements will not reduce your bill very much because the utility has had to plan for a particular peak, needs to recover those revenues, and it will inevitably have to have very high fixed costs in order to recover those revenues. Now, some of these rate design decisions can be made later, and potentially, the cost could be allocated on a much more variable basis. But those people who are paying variable rates then would have extraordinarily high costs relative to those who use less electricity. So, that sort of phase two revenue requirement piece where costs are allocated among customer groups, that would come later. Regardless, there is this very large revenue requirement that needs to be collected. Residential rate impact. So we see total heating and electricity bills. So your whole energy bill at your home, we're pushing $7,000 in the electricity case. So your electric heating is around $4,500 a year. That compares to roughly $1,600 today for your natural gas heating bill, with a carbon tax of $65 a ton, moving to about $2,300 a year in 2030 with carbon tax of $170 a ton. You'll notice that all your other electricity, so your EV charging, everything else, goes up by about $1,000 a year because of these high fixed costs associated with distribution system improvements. On the other hand, the hydrogen heating bill is about $4,100. Of this, the vast majority is energy. It can be influenced again by efficiency improvements. At T&D, about $862. This compares to, as I said, about $1,600 for natural gas heating today, plus roughly the $1,300. That doesn't change for electricity. And the other thing I'll say is that in the absence of a carbon tax, the affordability of natural gas space heating in Alberta is really unassailable. Really $1,100-1,200 is what you'd be looking at absent carbon tax. So electricity absolutely cannot compete with natural gas absent a carbon tax. Again, with air source heat pumps, if you're doing ground source heat pumps, that's a whole different equation, but then you have very, very high capital costs. Commercial rate impact, similar story here. Significantly higher costs associated with electric space heating if this is done at scale. If you use air source heat pumps versus H2 heating. And this is just one more challenge for businesses that are dealing with things, particularly in a place like Calgary with, property tax increases to deal with decline in downtown office values and stuff like this. Electric vehicles. So we didn't consider EV charging in this study. That would be incremental
Brody,
electric.
sorry to step in. I'm just going to do a time flag. We
Yeah.
have about 10 minutes left, and we've
Okay.
got a really great suite of questions.
Perfect. I'm just about on my last slide here. So, yeah, so we didn't consider electric vehicles in this study, but what happens is you take an electric vehicle, which actually has much lower op costs today than does an internal combustion vehicle, right? You look at the Tesla versus the Hondas, and you're getting close to triple the op costs if you're charging at home. Those costs get a lot closer if you electrify space heating, to the point where I would argue you may not opt for the EV if your home charging costs are roughly equivalent to the cost of fueling an internal combustion vehicle. So, there are some knock-on consequences to electrification of space heating that we need to think about as we're moving through these considerations. So in conclusion, I won't go through these in detail given the time constraint. I've really been through this already in my talk. One point I want to make here, though, is you often see people say, "Oh, well, there's lots of heat pumps in Scandinavia and Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland," and if you actually look at the climate in these places, it's not cold. The coldest temperature ever recorded in Stockholm, in Oslo, is like -23 or -25, something like this. These climates are actually a lot more comparable to Vancouver than they are at Edmonton, so it's not really a valid comparison. So that's the only thing I would add in conclusion. With that, I will wrap it up, and we can move to the questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Brody. I think you presented a very compelling comparison between the merits of electrification versus hydrogen. As you know, I did have a couple questions prepared for you. However, given the time, and we have some really excellent questions, I'm going to suggest that we move first to questions. So if you're okay with that,
Yep.
I'm going to also, if I could be so bold, just encourage you to be fairly crisp in your responses, because we do have a number of them. First question that came in from Anonymous. At some point, could you speak to what an integrated approach could look like versus the either approach, e.g. the use of hydrogen to possibly help balance the load?
Yeah.
So hydrogen electrification.
I mean, this is this certainly could be, there could be an integrated approach where you have heat pumps that are, for grid purposes need to shut down at, say, -10°C. And then maybe you have hydrogen taking over, or even natural gas as an interim solution, natural gas taking over at -10°C. You're seeing this hybrid approach taken in a number of jurisdictions, including in Quebec, where in fact Énergir is being paid by Hydro-Québec, a Crown Corp, a portion of its revenue requirement is being paid by Hydro-Quebec in order to have natural gas peak demand heating available so as to avoid the need to unnecessarily expand the electricity system in Quebec. So you're seeing some solutions like that. We're not doing integrated planning in Alberta today, but it may be a valuable thing to do in the future.
Thank you. Next question. Out of curiosity, why have you not considered direct heating as an option?
Director, do we mean district in this case?
Forgive me, district heating.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's going to be a place for district heating. What we found is that it's extraordinarily expensive. We've been involved in some RFPs on district heating and have found that it is roughly 500 to 700 times the cost of delivered energy of natural gas today for greenfield systems. Now, if you have an area where you have really good sources and sinks that can kind of seasonally interact, that can be a very, very good place for district energy. But for sort of the spread out communities that we have in Alberta, sort of low customer density, district energy just quite frankly is going to be extraordinarily expensive.
Thank you. Alvin asks, what is the overall efficiency of total input energy of production distribution of hydrogen to combustion of hydrogen?
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at roughly 80% at ATR with CCS, and then you're looking at, say, 95 at the furnace, so zero point 0.8 times 0.95, whatever that works out to you, and then um, whatever assumptions you want to make about, further upstream losses. Roughly, say, 2% fuel on the gas system to get the gas to the hydrogen plant. So, yeah, that would be uh, roughly the efficiency. But I will say that people care about cost more than they do about efficiency. So really, the goal here was to figure out which pathway results in the most affordable space heating.
Thank you. Ed asks, you mentioned that existing natural gas distribution systems are not meaningfully a problem. Does hydrogen content in the gas limit the life of the system? Of course, recognizing homes can last for a very long time,
Yeah.
upwards of 100 years.
No, it doesn't. So the distribution system operates at such a low pressure that things like stress corrosion cracking or sort of hydrogen induced cracking, they really don't become operative at the pressures that distribution systems operate at. This is sort of in the sub 100 psi range, um, and so and even polyethylene pipe. There's been some studies that have shown a reduction in creep life of polyethylene pipe, but it takes that number down from on the order of thousands of years to something like hundreds of years. So it's not, I guess, what I would say is the life reduction associated with the introduction of hydrogen is not relevant, given that the replacement frequency of gas systems is roughly in that 100-year mark today.
Okay, thanks. Question on water. Given that hydrogen energy is created from water, yes, certainly
Hmm.
both that electrolytic and the
Yeah.
blue production pathway, it's created involving water, and the likelihood that water will become less available, a scarcer resource. Where does ATCO anticipate a constant, reliable source of water for the creation of hydrogen for residential use?
Yeah, so in the northern part of the province, there is actually a fair bit of water capacity remaining. For example, in the North Saskatchewan River Basin, that's less so in southern Alberta. But the other thing I'd add to that is that if we're contemplating condensing appliances here, uh, we are actually recovering the water at the point of combustion. It ends up going into the stormwater system and back into the water basin, provided we're not using the type of appliances that emit the water in vapor phase. So that can be helpful in that regard.
Thank you. Lee has asked a question. Realistically speaking, can heat pumps really work well for Alberta cold weather periods? I think you've already answered that. Um,
Yeah, they can
Lee
work. It's
suggested, yeah,
question is whether they provide enough capacity. So
exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I think you've addressed that. Another question: what happens with the carbon after hydrogen is separated from methane gas?
So we're not talking pyrolysis here. This is ATR, uh, sort of a variation on SMR, I guess. Um, so the carbon is captured. We would be talking at the production level. All the blue hydrogen production facilities that have been proposed in Alberta are targeting a 95% plus CO2 capture rate. So that CO2 would be captured, put in a pipe, and injected underground permanently.
A good question here from a policy perspective.
Hmm.
Is there a level playing field market for both options, electrification and hydrogen? Wouldn't consumers decide by themselves what makes best sense for them?
Yeah, I think they would. And I think this is a question for policymakers. How do we incentivize the pathways that result in the least cost and the lowest impact for Albertans and Canadians? And I do think that this is a significant question, and it's not something that I've addressed here or that we've addressed in any kind of detail, but it should be lurking in the back of everyone's minds.
And certainly from a government perspective, that's really top of mind, I would say, for both officials and decision makers. One last question. I think it's a good
Sure.
one, Brody. Where do you think investors should be looking at throughout this process? Hydrogen appliances, the pipe infrastructure, hydrogen production, or storage?
Well, what I would say is that we're not proposing to go out and start converting customers to hydrogen at scale in Alberta today. This is a theoretical exercise. What we have proposed to do is to begin blending hydrogen into natural gas. And by doing so, we are able to get in place the pipeline infrastructure that can transport pure hydrogen. When you have that infrastructure in place, you can start deep decarbonization in other sectors, whether that's industrial or fertilizer production or whatever the case may be. But in our view, blending really unlocks this hydrogen economy that's sort of ready to get going in the province. But we do have a chicken and egg problem. And by facilitating blending, that is how we are able to advance this whole proposal. So we really encourage, as has been mentioned in the Alberta Hydrogen Roadmap, that the provincial government remove the roadblocks to blending so that can move forward. And I think we'll start seeing some much larger decarbonization as a result, if we're able to do that. In terms of investors, I can't tell you where money should be going. Certainly not at a personal level, but look, I think in Alberta, hydrogen has a big part to play in decarbonization.
Excellent. Well, that's actually a wonderful place, I would say, to end. I think you've identified some significant additional work that needs to be done, certainly from a policy perspective. So I would like to just thank you very much, Brody. You've given an excellent overview. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. I think this is really keeps this conversation moving forward in the hydrogen space. And certainly the Alberta government continues to regard this hydrogen economy as being an important way in which we can both create sustainable value from an economic perspective, as well as decarbonize our economy broadly. So I will conclude now. I'll say the recording of this webinar will be available on the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub website, as well as their YouTube channel within the next day or so. The next planned webinar will be December 14th, It will be exploring a recent transition accelerator report on hydrogen and decarbonization of steel production in Canada. So please do go ahead, registered at erh2.ca, and of course follow them on social media to stay in the loop on upcoming events. So thank you again, Brody. You ran a very tight ship. We're right on time, top of the hour. So I wish everyone then a very good day.